Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Make it the creepiest that I've ever seen. On this episode of Moving Panels, we discuss the first 3 episodes of The Sandman. Welcome to Moving Panels, the podcast where we discuss movies and TV shows based on, inspired by, and adapted from the world of comic books. I'm your host, Laramy Wells, and joining me today in the co-host chair from way back in our first year, please welcome back Kimberly Cheek.
I've escaped the fishbowl. I'm free now.
And it's wonderful to have you back, to hear it's going to be a new voice for probably some people, but then those who's been around since the beginning will remember you from your previous 2 episodes.
And you can always go back and listen.
You can. The archive is always there for you. But we are going to talk about, so we've talked about She-Hulk in the last review episode, and we talked about the first 3 episodes. And since in September I like to do television shows, I said, what other new television show is there we can talk about? And of course, there's Netflix's The Sandman. And so we're going to talk about the first 3 episodes. Now, of course, that, unlike She-Hulk, all that is out. All 11 episodes are there. But we are only going to talk about the first 3, maybe pique your interest if you haven't seen it. And you can go watch the rest. And then maybe we'll come back at some other time and do later episodes. But now, I have actually only seen the first 3 episodes, but you've seen the entire series, right? Yes,
I even watched episode 11 when it dropped that day.
So, were you familiar with the Sandman property prior? Was that what piqued your interest?
Yeah, I've been waiting for this. I'd been hearing about the movie for a few years. I think it's way better that's a streaming TV show. Yeah.
I do think the way this is playing out, it does work better. What were your thoughts when Joseph Gordon-Levitt was behind being the Sandman for possibly a movie, which was 2016 was when that was announced?
Yeah. He's a good actor. I'd have heard the pitch. I'd be more concerned about the story of what they would do in a movie to reduce it down.
Yeah, because the comic run is 76 issues? What is the comic?
It's 10 graphic novels, so I'm not sure how many issues.
Yeah. I wanted to say it was 70-something was all the individual breakdown. I'm trying to look it up really quick while we're talking, but I can't seem to find it.
Yeah, just the Sandman run, not all the extra books and spinoffs.
Yes, yeah, not all they brought it back in the 2000s. Of course, this first run was 89 to 96, written by the great and talented Neil Gaiman. Are you familiar with other Neil Gaiman properties? Are you a Neil Gaiman fan?
Oh, yeah. American Gods is one of my favorite books, even though then I didn't like the TV show.
See, now, I bought the book with all the intention in the world of reading it, have not read it yet, and I've never watched the show. But that is one that just the concept was interesting to me. What about Good Omens? Did you watch that? I never read, but I watched the show. Did you watch the show?
I did watch the show, but I still haven't read the book, and I've had it sitting on a bookshelf since high school, so I have no excuses.
Oh, wow. Now, I have books like that. I have those where I've just bought them with all intentions in the world and then just never got around to it, like I said with American Gods. Have you listened? I have not, but have you listened to the audiobook that Audible put out? What was it, just a year ago?
Yeah, I heard some clips from it because they had some very interesting people reading. For me, I don't think comic book translates to audio well enough, but it was an interesting depiction of it.
Yeah, I was curious. I haven't. I know it was James McAvoy was Dream.
Uh-huh.
Who was Joanna Constantine? Because I know they used Joanna in the audiobook too, didn't they?
Yeah.
But you don't know who the actress was?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay, well, that's fine. Because we're here to talk about the television show. But again, let's get into the comic a little bit, since this is entirely based off of one comic run. The Sandman, which we mentioned earlier, written by Neil Gaiman, was first released November 29th of 1988. It was actually a twist on a previous character. There were actually 2 Sandmans before this Sandman. One of them they actually reference in the comic, which was the Sandman that's kind of associated with the Justice Society of America.
Wes Dodds.
But from what I gathered, this was Neil Gaiman wanting to update the Garrett Stanford version, which was the more like superhero Sandman that Jack Kirby helped create. Are you familiar with that one?
Yeah, his more brightly colored counterpart.
Yeah, red and yellow super suit. But yeah, Joe Simon, Jack Kirby created this character in the 70s. He wasn't around for long. I know he was part of Infinity Inc. for a little while. But yeah, that was apparently what Neil Gaiman wanted to do, was he wanted to just do a twist on that character, who was supposedly the actual Sandman from mythology. He just was dressed like a superhero. But luckily, DC eventually came to him and said, we want an all-new Sandman. And Neil Gaiman was like, okay, well, what's the deal? And he goes, nope, that's it. You have full control. You can do anything you want. We just do it. And we got what we got. And it's considered one of the greatest, I guess you'd say, stories, even though it lasted for several years, but comic book runs, whatever you want to say, of all time.
It's such a good introduction to comics, because superhero comics can be so really intimidating to step into, whereas this has a beginning and sort of has an end. And if you read nothing else, if you just stuck to this, you'd still know what was going on.
Yeah, and of course it does exist in the DC universe, the overall comic universe of DC. Thus, we have John Constantine or Joanna Constantine that everybody's familiar with. But also in the comic, as we'll talk about a little bit more, there's crossover with a bunch of other characters. But the original artist, because the artwork is something special in this comic, was done by Sam Keith, who I first found out about when he did the Max for Image Comics back in the 90s. Mm-hmm. Were you familiar with the Max?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually a fan of that character, and there was even he was even featured on an MTV cartoon.
I haven't seen that.
Yeah, I vaguely remember. I just remember it being a cartoon. But whereas the artwork inside the comic is amazing, it is the cover art that makes these comics stick out. And those were all done by Dave McKean, who's done, artwork for Stephen King. He's done artwork for Neil Gaiman, for I want to say Alan Moore. But I remember the first time I saw a Sandman comic, it was in a library, and it was the cover art that caught my attention.
It's really something different, especially from DC. You get a dark, really ethereal cover, especially on those first several issues.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But let's go ahead and jump into it. Let's start talking about the characters and what we thought. I'll list off kind of some main ones. You can mention ones you want to, and then we can go into detail if we need to. But playing our main character, the Sandman, although officially his name's Dream, played by I was about to say both of his names at the same time. Tom Sturridge, British actor, hasn't done an awful lot. Pirate Radio was the only thing I think I had ever seen him in before. Then you've got and again, we'll talk about this a little bit more, who I believe is going to be the main villain, even though, like I said, I've only seen the first 3 episodes. And that's the Corinthian, played by Boyd Holbrook. Again, right off the bat, we get introduced to him, though he doesn't appear until issue 10 in the actual comic series. And again, not a very big character in the comic, but we'll talk about a little bit more about that. Then you got Lucian, played by Vivian, and I am going to butcher her last name. I apologize. Akimimpong. And this is the first of our gender swap characters. In the comic, it's Lucian, so very similar, or Lucin, who is a man in the comic, but no problem here. Although he is one of the first characters we get that this wasn't the first appearance for that character, because Lucin had actually appeared almost a decade earlier in Weird Mystery Tales in 1975. We then have our other main villain, John D., played by David Thewlis, who most people will probably recognize from pretty much anything. And he's Dr. Destiny in the comics. So there's our first big comic connection. They took kind of a second-rate Justice League Green Lantern villain. His abilities as Dr. Destiny they were retconned for this story. So the whole idea of him having dreams Ruby was not originally a part of this character, but they made it part of it. Then you got our other gender swap, kind of, in Joanna Constantine, played by Jenna Coleman, or as I just immediately call her, Clara from Doctor Who. Of course, it is John Constantine in the comics, although the reason why I said it's not entirely a gender swap is because Joanna Constantine does exist in the Sandman comics.
And she does exist later in the show.
So yeah, there is a 18th century, it's supposed to be John's ancestor, who of course would be Joanna's ancestor. We then have Jolie Richardson playing Ethel Crisp, who is also kind of changed a little from the comic. And then finally, the one I wanted to mention was Matthew the Raven, voiced by Patton Oswalt.
A rare, not British person.
Yeah. Well, although Matthew, it is Matt Cable from Swamp Thing.
Yeah.
And so he's not British. So it does make sense for him not to be British. But for people who don't know that, this is a Swamp Thing character who died and then came back to life as life, quote unquote, but came back as a Raven. So
a
Matthew
potential
the Raven.
Story to go forward with if we get a season 2 or 3 or 4.
Yeah, I do know he appears later in the comics. So again, none of these characters are not from the comic. They might be variations. For instance, the Corinthian. Let's talk about the Corinthian. So I do know from the comics that the Corinthian is in the comic, but to my knowledge, and it's been a while since I've read that far into the comics, doesn't the Corinthian show up and then is immediately uncreated by a dream?
I don't think it's immediately. He definitely doesn't have as big of a role in the comics.
Yeah.
But he doesn't make it very long. He gets to be a good, delicious bad guy and then gets poofed.
So I wonder what and again, we don't want to spoil anything past the first 3 episodes. We are going to spoil the first 3 episodes, but I think it's a good little appetizer to potentially what the show will be. So me speaking as someone who has not seen the first 3 episodes, do they overuse this character? Do they misuse this character? What would your opinion be?
I think he's used very well. He's sort of...
Because at this point, in these first 3 episodes, he's not replacing a character from this early on in the story. So it's been very interesting to see how they're intertwining him into the story.
He is a bit more of a specter in this to help facilitate events going forward in the order that he wants them to than he is in the comics. He's a bit more of an active player since he doesn't want Dream to come back. But I don't think they overuse him, and I think they stay definitely true to what the Corinthian is, though maybe he's updated for the times we're in now.
Yeah, of course that is, you're looking at the original book coming out in the late 80s and then into the 90s, and of course now we're in 2022, and they do set this in modern time. So not only the setting, but yeah, like you're saying, even just the what word am I looking for? But kind of like what you said, the world we live in, the way society has even kind of changed.
And
I think it
he ends up being a bit, I don't want to say any spoilers at all, but he ends up being a bit more complex and well-rounded, but that's really due to more screen time too.
Yeah. So we are introduced to Joanna Constantine, and we're actually given her background is the same as John, but that background's not in the Sandman comics, right?
I don't think Astrid is mentioned at all in the Sandman
Yeah, that's
comics.
what I'm saying, yeah.
That's just a thing that if you'd been reading other Vertigo comics, you probably knew that's why he was so sad all the time.
But what are your thoughts on Jenna Coleman playing Joanna?
I liked it. I would have liked to have seen her be a messier human, because she's a lot more polished in her appearance, at least, than John Constantine. That
was my thought too, was that she's, they have her in a kind of like a trench coat, but it's all buttoned up.
And it's white.
Yeah, she's very well kept, but yet she still speaks like the character of John Constantine.
Yeah.
You know, her, not only the use of vulgar language, but just in her cadence, I would even say, like she speaks the way you read the character. So yeah, it doesn't. There is kind of a disconnect, which is why I wanted to ask you that. So it's good that you have the same kind of thought that I do about that.
And she didn't have, and if I recall, and the CW show, Constantine didn't constantly smoke like he does in the comics, and she never picked up a cigarette either, so that was notable.
Yeah. Well, I also, that's been like just a thing with putting it on movies and TV shows, is trying not to, I guess, glamorize the smoking.
Yeah.
I know they did it for the Keanu Reeves movie, but I know there's a lot of, when you see him in TVs and movies, that he has a lollipop instead of a cigarette. So at least he still has the kind of the same idea of, he's always got that in his mouth or handling it with his hand. So were there any... Well, okay, actually, I want to talk about Ethel. Let's talk about Ethel. This character, to me, was a throwaway character in the comic at this point.
But she's so good in this show. She gets on the screen and owns it immediately.
I mean, it's Jolie Richardson, yeah. She does a great job. But why not do the Sykes story? Because they completely ignore Sykes in this TV show.
I mean, I'm guessing it's the sake of time. They do preloads and nocturnes, and then the Doll's House, and they could press that into 10 episodes. Yeah. So, I mean, that was a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah, I could see that. It's just, when I'm watching it in that first episode, when they introduced Sykes, I was like, oh, that's Sykes. And I was actually already kind of anticipating, I'm kind of curious the CGI they're going to use for his death.
Yeah.
But then they don't acknowledge him being that important at all. So he's more of an Easter egg to the comic fans, going, oh, that's Sykes. But then they just do everything through Ethel.
Maybe it was more of a mislead, because everybody who has read is going to be going, oh, I know what's going to happen, and well, then no, you don't. Not exactly.
Yeah. Now, the fact that she was Burgess's mistress, that's not immediately revealed in the comics, right? Yeah.
I don't remember that anyway.
We just know that, we know that she's John Dee's mom. We know that she ended up with the little amulet, the eye of protection. We know that from the comic. That happens because Sykes is the one that steals everything from Burgess. He runs off with Ethel, the mistress, but then Ethel steals everything from him, which then causes Sykes to explode, because Burgess had put so many hexes on him. So because he's no longer protected, which that was confusing too. Doesn't Ethel tell John in the show that the amulet will not work for you?
So she says that it will protect him, but it won't do the same things it did for her. And I think that was implying, like, the aging thing. Like, it's not going to make him essentially immortal like she is.
Okay.
That was kind of yada yada and unclear.
Well, it's also unclear because you're talking... She got pregnant with him in, 1930?
Yeah. Thereabouts.
And so wouldn't he be like 90-something years old?
Well, I figured when he had the ruby, or when she had the ruby, they maybe messed around with that. But that wasn't necessarily the protection items bonus.
So somehow he also either slowly aged or something?
Or he took it back a few years when he had it. And they never do really explain that. They just move on. Yeah.
Were there any other characters you want to mention? I didn't think the Burgesses were that important. We will talk about the storyline a little bit more later, but it was kind of amazing to me that you get an actor like Charles Dance to play Burgess, and then he's only in one episode.
Well, he was very expensive, but he's like, oh, this sounds cool. I like Neil Gaiman. I'll show up. But I really liked Cain and Abel. I thought that was real fun. I'm glad we got him in there. Because I would have expected them to cut that.
They kind of seem like just a crazy... Although, I will say this. Neil Gaiman has admitted that the first maybe couple of issues were really hard for him to write. And I have to be honest, they're hard to read. Because they jump all over the place. And I don't know if this is you, but I think even the layout of those first couple of comics, it's hard to follow the flow. Like, what is going on? Where is this happening? Because when Dream ends up back in the dream world and ends up at Cain and Abel, and Abel's house, just it was like, because in the comic, what happens is Gregory, the gargoyle, somehow finds Dream and then carries him back to Cain and Abel's house.
Yeah.
And then then you're just like, wait, what just happened? Because it just all of a sudden comes out of the blue. Like, here's Dream just being carried in the mouth of a gargoyle, showing up at these two dudes' house, and then apparently we're back in the dream world, and I don't know. Was it just me, or does the comic kind of get a little jumpy when it comes to stuff like that?
It definitely started rougher than it ended up, and I don't know if I'd have stayed for as long as I did if I hadn't have had the first two complete books right in front of me when I started reading. I kind of like the disjointed layout just because I like how weird the art is, but I definitely agree about the writing, and I was there for the avant-garde strangeness of it, so the layout didn't bother me, and I was used to reading comics anyway.
Yeah, and it would probably help, just for anyone who's interested in going back and reading it with, the day and age that we are now, it probably would help to read it digitally, where you can actually have it move from panel to panel, so that you actually know what you're supposed to read next.
Or get it in a really big print if you can find it, instead of getting something normal sized.
Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, it's definitely worth the read. I would get it, but yeah, do realize you may have to get through the first one or two issues, so the first couple of parts of the story before you can really get into it. In my opinion. All right, but of all these characters, I usually ask this, even though we are talking about kind of a self-contained story. But of all these characters, I'm going to ask what I usually do. Who would you like to see more of? And who do you wish would have their insides become their outsides?
I am a stereotype, and while she hasn't shown up yet, I do want to see more of Death in this show. Okay. If we're going to go from the first 3 episodes, I'd like to see some more side stories style episodes with Cain and Abel, or anything in the dreaming. I think that'd be real fun. I
realize you could also just be saying based off of character performance, like who did you like and who did you go, yeah, that just didn't work, I don't need to see you anymore.
I mean, I really, the Corinthian as a villain in the comics really stayed with me, and they rounded him out so much here. It's like, oh, I'm kind of sad he's gone. But still, if he, exploded in episode 1, that would have been nice to see. I would have got that comic book enjoyment out of it, too, of yeah, bad guy dead.
I think I would actually, we talked about how well Jolie Richardson plays Ethel. I would actually have liked to have seen her last a little longer.
To do more, yeah.
Yeah, maybe, if there was maybe a way that she could have still given John the amulet, but then was still able to survive a little longer. Maybe she does get older, but she's bedridden or something, and so we can still get a performance out of her. I don't know. I think I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of Ethel. I'm gonna be honest. At least based off of, again, the first 3 episodes, I could do without Matthew the Raven.
A lot of people have said, well, he's just so disjointed in there. And I really didn't. Yeah. I like him in the comics, but it was weird in the TV show, his introduction. I could feel the Patton Oswalt, even though I like what they end up doing with the character later on.
Yeah, like I said, I do know he's kind of semi-important to the story later. But yeah, Patton Oswalt, it feels so disconnected from the style that the show's going for. So
I mean, I know he's supposed to be a foil to the very serious, very grumpy Dream, and that's very TV, but still, it was strange.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have minded if it stayed in the dark place a little longer.
What seems to be the problem, pal?
There's just so much pain in the world, so many issues. I don't think I can bear it.
Hell, friendo, it sounds like you could use a dose of pop culture roulette.
Pop culture roulette? What's that? Some sort of pop culture themed podcast or something?
That's right, sonny boy. When hope seems far, dive into some PCR.
But I already get my entertainment news from Variety.
Huh, that's pretty good. If you're a chucklehead, PCR gives you news you need, condensed, unfiltered, and raw, from three nerds who know a little something about something.
Wow, okay, sign me up.
That's the spirit. Pop Culture Roulette. New episodes every Monday, available on all major podcast directories.
All right, well, let's jump into the moving panels. Again, you are very familiar with the comic. I read it a long time ago. I'm in the process of rereading it so that I could, compare it with the series. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. They're keeping it pretty consistent with the individual issues. Like, episode 1 pretty much is issue number 1.
Yeah, like the opening monologue, I'm pretty sure is a direct quote from the comic, which is something they do a few times throughout the series.
Yeah, the opening monologue I didn't remember as much, but as soon as, we saw I forgot his name, but the older guy who brings Burgess the book,
yeah,
I was like, oh, this is shot for shot, if not line for line. And then, of course, it ending with Dream's escape. I was like, I'm pretty sure this is exactly issue number 1. Now, what were your thoughts on let's talk about some of the changes. So we've already talked about Sykes being not that big of a deal, but one of the bigger ones, what about the whole Burgess having 2 sons?
I don't understand why that was the case anyway.
Well, it kind of changed his motivation, because in the comic he wants to be immortal.
Yeah.
Like, he just wants the power of immortality, whereas in the show, they're making it that he wants his son back. They don't really talk about the immortality part. He's just saying, I want my son back.
But I don't even know why that was changed, because it doesn't, he's still a horrible person. It doesn't necessarily make him more sympathetic at all.
Yeah, that is true. If anything, it makes you maybe a little bit more sympathetic for Alex.
Maybe.
But, yeah. And see, that's the other thing. Alex, I don't think they were able to go deep enough into that character in the time they had for us to really care about him. And then the other big change of him actually murdering his father.
Yeah.
Because in the comic, they just grow old and his father just dies of old age.
And it leaves a very different feeling, which, yay, bad guy dead. But I guess that hurried it along.
And that's the thing. They then hurry it very quickly along, because you go from Alex being kind of a sympathetic character, and then he has that connection with Dream, and you're thinking, okay, there's going to be something to this. But then as soon as he murders his father, it's just, nope, now I'm the bad guy, and I'm going to keep you locked up until I'm old and rugged, and then they just rush through that. Like, just all of a sudden, immediately, he's an old man in a wheelchair.
Yeah, they kind of pushed towards the ending, but I guess we got enough to tell the story for Dream and where Dream was coming from.
Yeah.
It carries him through.
Now, what was your thought on, it was a subtle thing, but I noticed it. Everybody has to notice it, but when they did the bit where Alex, comes to visit him in the wheelchair, and then when the guy turns the wheelchair around, it breaks the circle. What were your thoughts about the guy then looking and realizing, oh, we broke the circle. Oh, well, and then just keeps going?
I guess he kind of figures that this is his boyfriend's end there, that this is the sad part, and so maybe it just doesn't matter anymore. I almost thought he did it on purpose.
Yeah, that I did feel that it, whereas in the comic it is completely done accidental.
Yeah.
It kind of did make it more feel like maybe he did do it on purpose, that he just wants this all to, he just wants it all to be over.
Yeah.
So yeah, I got that. I will say this, I did like, because the look of Dream in the comic is very unique. And I like that the very first time we see Dream, like see him in the trap. I mean, obviously we saw him earlier when he chooses to leave. But when we see him in the trap, they light him so that his eyes actually look like they do in the comic.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite parts.
When he just turns and looks at them, and he's got that pale look, and he's the black eyes with kind of the little star almost inside of them. So I did appreciate they at least acknowledged, yeah, we know this is what he looks like in the comics. We can't do that for an entire series, but here you go. Here's your one little acknowledgement to the look of the character.
I mean, as far as the looks goes, he doesn't have that Robert Smith crazy trad goth hair, but I think it's pretty close as far as a human being adaptation could go.
Yeah. I mean, it could be worse. It could be the same way they tried to do it in the Dragon Ball Z movie.
Oh.
Yeah. So... but overall, what were your thoughts on episode 1, Sleep of the Just, like for an introduction to the show?
I was so excited. I mean, I was pretty jazzed for this anyway, but I saw American Gods and I'm like, this is such a disappointing adaptation of something I love. And I was like, I'm prepared to be disappointed, but I watched that first episode and I'm like, this is everything I wanted, and I'm surprised.
So if you can detach yourself from being a fan of the comic, because we talked about how in the comic you have to kind of struggle through the first couple of issues. If you knew nothing about the comic, do you think this episode is enough to grab someone to watch 10 more episodes?
I think it does depend on the style of TV writing you like, because I love the pacing of this. I like that they take time and you get to appreciate the actors acting. If you want something faster paced, if you want 4 plot lines in the same episode, this probably is not for you. But if you like darker aesthetic of it, if you like the weird nature of it, I think regardless you're going to be interested in this.
Now, I will say the opening, when the monologue's going on, we see the Raven flying and flies into Dream World, and we see the castle, and then we go in and we see Lucian and Dream in the clearly green screen, inside of a castle. I will admit it kind of felt a little Sci-Fi Channel to me.
For as much money as this cost, because a lot of what we've been hearing about getting any future season is this was just obscenely expensive. It was a little bit TV for that.
Again, it gets better, but for that to be kind of our first, like, hey, this is where we're starting, I was just like, it feels a little Sci-Fi Channel. It feels a little like I had thoughts back to do you remember the Tin Man miniseries on Sci-Fi?
Yeah. I mean,
just because of the inside of the castle. That was the inside of the castle was what gave me that feel.
It was nice test footage, and they just decided, we have a lot to do and a lot of money to spend. We're just going to keep this. But the castle always looks a little weird, so maybe that's also artistic intention to make it look more dreamlike. Yeah,
being in the dream world, there needs to be a little bit more, but yeah, showing it and at the beginning with the Raven flying through and you see like the dragon and all this other stuff, I was like, yeah, this is feeling a little sci-fi, feeling a little if to go way back, because I'm a big fan of this Hallmark movie, The 10th Kingdom. Kind of
horrible, excellent, wonderful miniseries.
Yeah, but kind of gave me impressions of like one of those type of movies. But moving on to episode 2, which was called Imperfect Host, which I do believe is also the title of the second issue of the comic. We get to find out the dreaming is in tatters, just like we see. They do it from being inside of the castle. We get a nice little kind of showing for the first time, showing the dream's powers as he attempts to reconstruct the castle. I thought that was a nice little thing to show he's powerful, but he's weak. And here's now why he's weak, because he has lost these, as he calls them, tools.
And he lost his mojo. He's not used to doing what he used to do anymore.
Yeah, because it's been, they have to, since they've updated this to modern time, he was trapped for a century almost. Whereas in the comic, it was only 70 years. But here, since they started it at pretty much the same time, and, what was it, 1916? Mm-hmm. And then now it's, we just assume it's 2022 or 2021 in the show. So it's been over 100 years that he's been locked up. So, yeah. Then we get Cain and Abel, although those events happen out of order from the comic. He sees Cain and Abel first, and then eventually ends up at his castle. Here we at the castle, then he shows up at Cain and Abel's. What were your thoughts on the Gregory story?
Oh, they did. I thought that was a beautiful job. I thought that was really good. And it made Dream, who we've only seen be bitter and kind of a jerk, seem a little sad about being a jerk.
Yeah.
A little remorseful that he had to do what he had to do, and that he was having to do it was kind of his fault.
Yeah, I want to ask your take on this, but let's talk about, so in the comic, Gregory is a gargoyle that is the pet of Cain and Abel. Dream does not uncreate Gregory. Instead, Dream gets letters that he apparently signed to Cain and Abel, and that is what he uses to kind of draw some power back.
Yeah, it's not as sad and beautiful.
Yeah.
It's a little more efficient.
Yeah. So I do agree that this kind of gives a little bit more depth to Dream's character. It also gives you a nice little moment, even though, again, the pacing, you didn't really get that connected to Gregory. Maybe if they had stretched it out a little bit.
Or done that a little bit later, at least in that episode.
Yeah, to where you're at least introduced to Gregory. You kind of see the relationship that Abel has with Gregory. I think they did okay. You do see Gregory as more of a puppy dog. And even when Dream goes to approach Gregory, Gregory's, playing with the ball. So I think they did okay. I just think if they really wanted to hit that emotional chord that it feels like they were trying to hit, stretching it out a little bit more. But the question I wanted to ask you, did that create a plot hole for when Abel comes back from the dead and finds the egg, and then the egg has Goldie / Irwin? Did that create a plot hole? Because if Gregory was created by Dream, did Dream then create this gargoyle? Because they kind of imply it, but then that doesn't really make a lot of sense as to why would he just create another one?
Kind of like the amulet stuff, they sort of yada their magic rules in this. They're not quite, I don't remember them being quite as messy in the comic with it, but they also didn't leave you as much room to think about it. But yeah, because he had to make it. It couldn't have just happened.
Yeah.
And if he had pulled it out of someone else's dream, a human's dream, then we didn't explain that at all. And since he has trouble doing that later in the episode, that's unlikely.
Yeah, because in the comic, the egg is a gift from Cain to Abel. Mm-hmm. But then we're also under the impression that the gargoyles just exist in the dream world. They're not necessarily creations by Dream.
Well,
so
it's a discussion in the fandom for the show to just sort of, well, what exactly comes from people and what exactly does Dream himself create? Or does he just take influence from humans and make everything? Or does he make some things specifically like the Corinthian just to exist with all the other dreams?
Yeah, and again, that could be a whole conversation all in itself. But let's go ahead and move on. The other big plot point in episode 2 that connects with the comics is him meeting with the Fates. What were your thoughts on this portrayal of the 3 Fates?
I think it lines up pretty close with the comics, as close as they're probably going to go with the TV show.
Yeah.
I really liked how he summoned him. I thought that was fun, and they did a good job on the CGI there.
Yeah, where it went into the dreams, and we're taking various things from the dreams. I like that. I liked how they shot it very similar to the comic, where each time you see them, it's a different one in the center to show how they are. Like he says, 3 in 1, 1 in 3. So really, it's there's not 3 different personalities there. Of course, big change is when they tell him about where his 3 items are. The sand being in possession of John Constantine, or Joanna in this show, that's the same. The ruby being connected to John D is the same. However, the difference is in the comic books, it is in the possession of the Justice League of America. Mm-hmm. And we even have a scene in the comic where he visits, of course, it's Justice League International at this point in the comics, but he visits Mr. Miracle in his dream. And then they have an interaction with Martian Manhunter.
And that is one of my favorite parts of the early issues of the comics, and we never could have had it in the show. We didn't.
Yeah, you can't have it in the show. Yeah.
But it is. Just go look up that one scene. It's a couple pages. It's worth reading. Because
in Mr. Miracle, or Scott Free, I guess you would say, in his dream, we even have a little Granny Goodness cameo. But even when the Fates are telling him about it, you get a Batman cameo. Mm-hmm. Because it shows Batman being the one that took the ruby off of Dr. Destiny. And then the helmet being in possession of a demon, that also exactly like it is from the comics. So I like that there wasn't a lot of change of that. Obviously, the Justice League stuff had to be removed because the show's not going to have the connection to the DC universe in that way. But episode 2, what were your thoughts on episode 2 overall?
I enjoyed it. I think out of the 3, that was probably my favorite just because I like playing around in the dreaming. I like the weirder aspects of Morpheus just digging through dreams and grabbing literal crossroads out of somebody's brain.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. Just him reaching down and just pulling out a crossroad. Just for people who aren't familiar and are listening to this without knowing anything, because Kimberly just said Morpheus. That is another name that Dream goes by. Is Morpheus. There's a lot of names that he goes by in the comics.
It works better in the show when you're looking at a character.
So just being aware of that. All right, let's hit our final episode here and wrap this up. Episode 3, Dream a Little Dream of Me, which I gotta say, to title the episode Dream a Little Dream of Me, but then not feature the aspect of the comic where John Constantine is constantly hearing songs about dreaming, I really wish they had put that in the show.
Too expensive.
Yeah, I guess. But of course they do still have Mad Hetty that kind of gives John the heads up.
That's another comic book if you know nod.
Yeah, because she's from the Hellblazer comics that Constantine is a part of. And so yeah, having her, and she looked straight out of the comic too. Like she was dressed exactly like she is in the comics. So I did like that. But this was kind of our introduction to Joanna. We got the backstory, which we said is not part of the Sandman storyline, but it is important to Constantine. So we got that backstory. They did stick with the story of Constantine having the relationship with Rachel. Oh, let's stop for a minute. So I'm always going to say Constantine, but in the show they say Constantine.
Which no one does. No one.
No,
does
because
it that way.
even in the comic, there's a part where it's like said slowly, and they spell it Teen, and I'm like, you can't say Tyne when you're spelling it in. When Neil Gaiman is writing it in the comic, Teen, it's teen. It's Constantine. And I mean, I took history classes. I've always heard it Constantine.
And it's not a British or American English thing either. They just say it differently in the show. Yeah,
I will say that bothers me a little bit. But back to what I was saying, they do the tie-in with Rachel, which they do not gender swap. So Rachel is Rachel. But although that does tie in with John Constantine in the comics being bisexual. And then we're also introduced to Ethel and, well, not introduced to Ethel, but this variation of Ethel, who is a like artifacts dealer, which I thought was a fun little twist.
And it makes sense. Very vampire.
Oh yeah. And then we're introduced to John Dee, who I was so glad they didn't decide to go with the zombie look for him like he is in the comics. But I will say this. He's not as sinister. At least, again, we're talking about the first 3 episodes. He's not as sinister, this version of him, as he is right off the bat in the comic.
And this actor, and you know he can do some evil faces and voices. He's real quiet. He's real reserved. He seems almost sweet sometimes.
Well, even when he, at the end, when he's escaping, and just everybody, because they're shooting at him, but he's protected. I didn't quite understand why just shooting at him causes you to explode. But
TV.
Yeah. I mean, it would have made more sense to me that if they shoot him, they get shot. You know, that whatever you try to do to me, it will actually happen to you. That would make more sense to me. Well, just the fact of I'm going to shoot at you and it's going to cause me to just explode.
Ethel left the setting on explode the person at any time, so it's just stuck on that now.
But even while that's happening, he almost portrays it as I hate this is happening. You know, as he's going out. Of course, in the comics, just to show again the DC connection, the place that he is being held is Arkham Asylum. And he actually escapes with really no problem whatsoever. There is a guard who is killed in his escape, but he's killed by the Scarecrow. John then escapes with a woman, threatens a woman to give him a ride. And then I'll let that go from there for no spoilers to anything. But yeah, I'm curious to see where John Dee's character kind of goes in the show with that aspect, with the fact that because in the comic he just wants chaos. Like he wants to bring the world to its end.
I want to give this warning while you get a little bit of a different John Dee. This show is rated R for a reason.
Oh yeah.
So he might be a little bit of a different character, a little less sinister, a little less historic baggage, but no, that's still John Dee.
All right, well, that is the first 3 episodes. I will say again, I have only watched the first 3 episodes, and I am ready to watch more. So hopefully, we've interest anyone who hasn't stepped into the world of the Sandman yet. And I think these first 3 episodes is a good introduction. Yes, we may have spoiled what happens in these first 3 episodes, but it does not spoil the overall story. So I think it's a good way for you to go, okay, well, now I'm interested. Let's see what happens. But as always, let's go ahead and do, even just for these first, and we're only going to talk about with these first 3 episodes, let's bag it, stack it, or trade it. So Kimberly, based off of just the first 3 episodes of The Sandman, what would you say?
I'm going to dip it in gold and shrine it and put it on a shelf.
You like it that much.
Mm-hmm. This was the best adaptation I was probably ever going to get for something this hard to adapt.
Look, those were my exact words that I have here on my notes. I said bag it for what you're saying. This is probably one of the best adaptations. And I'm not just talking about of Sandman. Like, this is one of the best adaptations I think I've ever seen. I mean, yeah, they changed some stuff as we've talked about, but I don't think they changed anything that wasn't, so far, has not been for the better.
I agree.
None of the changes have made the story less than.
And they may have helped it in some points for something that translated in the comic and didn't for a show. Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, if you're a comic book fan, if you've read Sandman, you're not going to be disappointed. Again, you will notice the changes, but I don't think you're going to go, oh, they ruined it by not doing this. I don't think that's the case. They've done a great job. My only gripe is with Matthew the Raven. I think he is, and it may just be the voice of Patton Oswalt, but it's like, we just need some comedy in this. And I'm going, no, you don't. And don't you have enough comedy from like Cain and Abel? Like Cain and Abel provide just a subtle amount of comedy. And if you keep coming back to stuff like that, I think that's fine enough. I mean, Constantine could add a little bit of comedy, but I'm Matthew the Raven's my one gripe. But again, I've just been introduced to Matthew the Raven in these first 3 episodes, so maybe, as you said, it gets a little bit better. But that would be my one thing.
I don't know where else they would introduce him than where they do. And if they're going to continue to keep him in a similar role to the comic, he's almost got to be there.
Well, my problem's not with introducing him. My problem is, like I said, with it being Patton Oswalt,
yeah.
I think.
It's just, you can see his face when he talks.
I have nothing against Patton Oswalt. Yeah, I have nothing against Patton Oswalt, but he doesn't fit in with the tone and the style of this series. His voice does not fit. Because the audiobook on Audible, it's Andy Serkis.
And he does a pretty good job. But I don't know that I don't know. It's not that Patton Oswalt is bad. It's not again, what I wanted, I guess. Yeah, it's just when he starts to speak, it feels tonally just separated from the rest of the show. And again, nothing against Patton Oswalt. It's just I think that was kind of some interesting casting. So they needed someone less nerd iconic, maybe.
Yeah. But that's it for this. Again, we talked about the first 3 episodes. Maybe we'll come back later and talk about the rest, if not break it down into maybe a few other episodes. But we'll end it there. Thank you, Kimberly, for joining me. It was glad to have you back.
It's nice to be here.
And thanks to everybody for listening. Rate and review us on Apple and Spotify. Follow us on social media. Listen out to our other friends in podcasts, 80s Flicks Flashback, Pop Culture Roulette, all those guys out there. And thanks for joining us today. And for Moving Panels, I'm Laramy Wells, and I'll see you on the other side of the page.
Life moves pretty fast. If you don't stop and listen to an 80s Flick Flashback podcast once in a while, you could miss it. Do you love movies of a certain age? Do you miss the days of VHS tapes, VCRs, and the video rental stores? Does the thought of another 80s movie being remade seem inconceivable? My name is Tim Williams. I'm the creator and host of the 80s Flick Flashback podcast. On each episode, I'm joined by guest co-hosts to discuss one of the many movies released in the 1980s. We share our first-time watch memories, our favorite scenes, and even learn some behind-the-scenes stories about the cast and crew along the way. New episodes are released every other Friday on your favorite podcasting platform. So make like a tree, get out of here, and go listen to an excellent episode of the 80s Flick Flashback podcast. The ad is over. Go home. Go.